Hello, everybody. Wait, does that? I don't know if I like that. Okay. Well, it's good to see Blair and Cyrus at our Purim extravaganza. I'm sorry you guys didn't join, but it was a lot of fun. It was a very good, fun day, and uh, hopefully you'll get in the future to join us. All right. Well, we're going to start. Oh yeah, it's 7:31. Okay, we're. I thought more people would be on this because this is such an interesting topic. But of course, we are recording it, and people can join in because the issue of the afterlife is an issue that most people interested in religion are curious about what different religions have to say about it. Um, and what I want to begin with is that one of the biggest misnomers about Judaism is that Jews don't believe in the afterlife, uh, which is very, very strange since it's kind of one of the things, according to Maimonides, you're supposed to. It's on his list of things one must believe in if you're a Jew. Doesn't mean that all Jews do, but I mean so it's a pretty big issue. But I mean, even it's in popular culture. Like I remember there was a Woody Allen movie a few years ago, and the main character's brother was a criminal, ends up in gets the death penalty, and converts in prison to Christianity. Um, because he says that since we Jews don't believe in the afterlife, and I'm interested in and I want to know that there is one, so something like that. So even in popular culture, it's this automatic view. It's ridiculous. So that's I want to dispel that tonight, but it's a very significant idea in Jewish teaching. And the other thing I was going to say, though, is that since nobody has died and come back to let us know what the afterlife is like, um, basically, all the things we'll hear tonight, all the things we'll learn, all the various different views about the afterlife, are really just different ways to try to explain how we make life meaningful in this world. Um, that is there's undercurrent of belief that if there is no afterlife, then the life that we're in, the life that we do live on this earth, is all kind of arbitrary. It can lead to hedonistic approach of life. It can lead to kind of depending on how one's life goes, it can lead to kind of to a depressed approach. The existentialist writer Camus asked he said the great question that we all have to face is, I mean, again, given the fact that there is no life after this one, then the great question we must all face is why not commit suicide? And what keeps us from committing suicide. So, that kind of approach doesn't make sense to one who believes that this world is not all that there is. The material world that we live in is not all that there is, because it means that there are consequences for how we live in this world, and how we live in this world is impacted on what comes afterwards. So, um, but since we don't know what comes afterwards, it's really all about convincing us that, to make this life that we are living meaningful. Okay, so there's a lot of material here, and we'll try to get through it all tonight. Let's begin with first in the Bible. The Bible, there's no clear discussion of life after death in the Bible. There are some references, I'll mention some of them, but really there's no discussion for the most part. First of all, because the Bible is mostly concerned with corporate Israel, that is, the people of Israel. The fear is that the people will be wiped out, either by their human enemies, or of course in the book of Exodus, and also in Numbers, where the people misbehave and God says, Moses, you and me and everybody else is out. And Moses then defends the people and keeps God from destroying the people. So the focus in at least in the Torah and really in most of the Bible, the concern is corporate Israel. The individual is important, but not that important. It's the people as a whole that are crucial. Um, the concern with Israel as a nation living on. However, we do have references to where people go after they die, and the one more prominent lines is in Genesis 37 when Jacob learns of that his beloved son Joseph has died. His other children try to comfort him, and his response is, "No, you can't help. I'm just going to go down mourning to my son in Sheol." So Sheol was a place, maybe it's a little bit connected like Hades in the Greek thought. It's a place underneath the ground where people, I guess, went when they died. We have another example in the book of Samuel. The Shaol is disturbed. Um, King Saul has been told by the prophet Samuel before the prophet died that God had taken away the kingship from him and his line, given it to David. And then Samuel dies, and Saul is losing a battle, and he's very, very worried about what to do. And he goes to a necromancer, the witch of Endor, and this is against Jewish law. You're not supposed to go to such magic type people, sorcerers and such. But he goes anyway because he's really nervous, and he says to her, "You won't get in trouble, but I need you to bring somebody up." She says, "So who shall I bring for you?" And he says, "Bring up Samuel for me." So then the woman recognized Samuel. So whatever she did, some vision was coming out of the ground, and she shrieked and said, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul. You're the king. You're gonna put me to death for doing this." And he says, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" And she said, "I see a divine being coming up from the earth." "What does he look like?" "It's an old man coming up, and he's wrapped in a robe." Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and Samuel says to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me and brought me up?" So in this exchange, once again, Sheol is a place, a physical place where people go after they die. It is a place where clearly the deceased, the souls, don't want to be disturbed. Um, Obviously, these people, they don't have physical bodies, but they're some kind of maybe a ghostly body or image, that because obviously they recognize it's Samuel. So that's about all we have. We don't have a lot of information about what happens after death. Um, but there are some allusions to the notion of resurrection, and uh, and that death is something that at the end of time, in the eschatological end times, will be over, that there won't be death anymore. So that's all that is in biblical thought. I mean, it's in the prophet Isaiah, where he's talking about the future, the end of time, when he says, "Your covenant with death shall be annulled, your pact with Sheol shall not endure." So that's one. That's a biblical vision, that just there won't be death anymore. Um, On the other hand, you do have a couple of slight um, allusions to resurrection. In that same book of Samuel, at the very beginning of the book, um, before Samuel is born, his mother Hannah, and we read this on Rosh Hashanah, his mother Hannah goes because she can't have children, she's infertile. She goes to the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and prays to God. First example we have of personal prayer, and she prays for a child. And in her prayer, she states, "The Lord deals death and gives life, casts down into Sheol and raises up." It's a little bit of an allusion, at least knowing what later traditional Judaism believed about the afterlife. A little bit of an allusion there to the notion of death and then there's life after death. Not too much description. The book of Daniel has another well-known reference to this idea. Now he's a later book also. Daniel's one is, if not the latest book in the canon, one of the later books. Um, and there's a verse in Daniel that says, "Many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence." So here's this idea of, oh, death isn't the end, and after death, there is something. But for some people, it's going to be a very pleasurable reawakening, and some not so much. But as I said, Daniel is a later book, um, and it's this later period of time, around 200 before the Common Era to 200 of the Common Era, which is what we call the apocryphal literature period. The apocryphal literature is our Jewish books, Hebrew books, although we don't have them. I don't know if any of them are extant in Hebrew anymore because they didn't make it into the Hebrew canon. They made it into the apocryphal section, the intertestamental books that are still in the Catholic tradition. So you have this um, period. We have a number of books, and in that apocryphal literature and other literature, I don't even know if it's all in the apocrypha, but some pseudepigraphical works. Pseudepigraphica are books from this period of time, but they're written like the Testament of Moses, as Moses supposedly wrote this. Well, he didn't write it. It's a later book, many, many hundreds of years after Moses, but it's ascribed to him. So there are a number of books like that. And in these, the literature from this period of time, after 200 before the Common Era, you do have much more material and even elaborate descriptions of what occurs in the afterlife. Um, One of the books, I think it's the book of Enoch. There's a number of books of Enoch, but I think it's the first book of Enoch where you have it's almost like Milton's Paradise Lost, where um, Enoch goes on this journey through paradise and through Gehenna, which is like hell, and the different levels and who lives at each of these levels. So we have that. And where does the question is, why all of a sudden do you have this elaboration of notions of journeys that the soul or the individual takes after death? Um, and one assumption is that it is an influence during this time of Hellenistic ideas as well as Eastern ideas. Some of the Eastern ideas are coming through Hellenism. Hellenism is was began with Alexander the Great and his conquests of the East, and then when he goes from Greece, Macedonia, to the East. He picks up these ideas from the East, and then he brings them back or they become filtered through all of the Hellenistic empire, and Jews are part of that empire. Um, and so that's one theory, is that there was, it was influenced from these other cultures that had these ideas. Another theory is that it developed during the Maccabean period, which is the second century before the Common Era. There's a passage in Maccabees 2. There are four books of Maccabees. I know one and two are in the Apocrypha. I can't remember if three and four are as well, but one and two are the really interesting ones. The first book of Maccabees is really a historical chronicle from that period of time. Maccabees 2, a little less so. But in Maccabees 2, written sometime after the Maccabean revolt, they have this verse where they talk about the books of the Maccabees talk about the various sacrifices that soldiers are making, that fighters are making. And in Maccabees 2, there's a verse, for if he had not been expecting the fallen to rise again, it would have been foolish to pray for the dead. But since he had in mind the wondrous reward for those who die a godly death, his purpose was a holy and pious one. This is why he offered atoning sacrifices to free the dead from their sin. Okay, that's something we don't have in the Bible. This notion that you're offering sacrifices to atone the dead from their sin, that it's a reward for um, um, the those who die a godly death, which probably means fighting for the good cause. And one theory is that this was problematic theologically for the Jewish people at this time, because so many people were being slaughtered. Um, Innocent people were being slaughtered, and they were trying to make sense of, well, how can this be? How can the individual, how is this fair? I've always wanted, I mean, obviously, there's always innocent people. I mean, that's the whole thing, is that in this world, people, that's the great question of religion, which is, why do good people die, and why do bad people get rewarded? So that seems to be the eternal question. I don't know why specifically at the period of the Maccabees this would have been all of a sudden this becomes a theological conundrum. That's why I assume it had to be because of these Hellenistic ideas, where there was a belief, or Eastern ideas that did believe that there was something after this one, where it becomes more prominent. But it could have been that the role of the individual just becomes more important. Certainly, the world we live in, the role of the individual is far more significant than it was 100 years ago. Still, there's still notions of individuality, but I mean, just think about today. Um, I mean, even something as basic as having children. If you're living in a culture, a world where you have 12 children, or the woman has 12 pregnancies, and if you're fortunate, half of them survive to adulthood. Um, you have a very different approach to life and death and the meaning of individual life than in our culture, where, I mean, it's getting bad again, but at least for most people who have decent health care, it is a total shock and a horrible, horrible tragedy if a child dies, um, because we just don't expect it. We assume if you're going to have people have two kids, both kids should make it at least to adulthood. So it's a very different. So it could be that during the Maccabean period, this idea of individuality became more significant. But I do think it had to do a lot with influence of other ideas. Um, but anyway, so that's about the beginning, where we start having this idea of that there is life in the next world, after this one. Um, let's see, just since I'm not looking at anybody, let me see if I get any questions here. Come on. There we go. Any questions so far? Okay. So then we get to the rabbinic period. Now, the rabbinic period, as I said, really develops this notion of a world that there is life after this one, and it becomes very significant to Jewish belief. It becomes part of traditional Jewish belief. Um, we don't have anything really specific or detailed about what the world will be. But there is this notion of olam haba, the world to come, as opposed to olam hazeh, which is the world that we live in. And there are different visions. There's lots of different perspectives on it. One found in the Talmud says that in the future world, there's no eating, nor drinking, nor propagation, no sexual relations, nor businesses, nor jealousy, nor hatred, nor competition. What is there? The righteous sit with their crowns on their heads, feasting on the radiance of the divine presence. And we have an allusion to that in the book of Exodus, where after the revelation at Sinai, we're told that they beheld God, the revelation, and then they ate and they drank. Well, once you see God, you're not eating, lunch. You're according to this spiritual interpretation, you are feasting off this divine radiance. You don't need material sustenance because the spiritual sustenance you receive is enough. So that's one image that we see, that the world to come is one in which it's a spiritual place. Here from this quotation, we can't tell if that means bodies, people are embodied in this world, this future world, or it's just souls. But whatever it is, it sounds like a beautiful place. And that where and this is different from the prophetic visions, right? We have these beautiful visions of Isaiah and other prophets of the world of the future, but those are this world images. That's like this world is going to be a perfect place. There's going to have paradise on earth. The rabbinic visions that we're talking about now are after death. So when it says Olam Haba, that's the world after death. People will have died. And then, of course, we develop the idea of Messiah, where the Messiah will enter and time will be different. The world's not going to be the same as it is. So that'll be a different change in the world history. And in this period of time, in that future world, and the it's going to be, things going to be just remarkable, and there won't be any kind of materialistic needs. Anyway, that's one image. Here's another image of rabbinic image of the world to come. Antoninus, the Roman emperor, said to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the body and the soul are able to exempt themselves from judgment for their sins. How so? The body says, the soul sinned, as from the day of my death when it departed from me. I am cast like a silent stone in the grave. I don't sin. The soul says, no, 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 it was the body that sinned, as from the day that I departed from it. I'm flying in the air like a bird, incapable of sin. So this is the Roman emperor, but obviously the question is, after you die, how can anybody be judged for their sins fairly? Because the body says, "Hey, I'm just a lump of clay. If without the soul, it animates me. So how can I be guilty for doing anything wrong? I'm like, the robot that the person's controlling." And the soul says, "What are you talking about? It's the body who has all the desires. Why should I get punished? I'm from God. I'm pure." So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi responds, I'll give you a parable. So what's the matter comparable? It is comparable to a king of flesh and blood who had a fine orchard, and in it there were fine first fruits of a fig tree. And he stationed two guards in the orchard, one lame and one unable to walk, and one blind. because he was afraid that they would go eat the beautiful figs. So he didn't want them, but he needed two guards. So, and therefore neither was capable of reaching the fruit on the trees without the assistance of the other. So the lame person says to the blind person, I see the fine first fruits of the fig tree. Come and put me on your shoulders. I'll guide you to the tree and we'll bring the figs to eat them. The lame person rode on the shoulders of the blind person, and they brought the figs and they ate them. Sometime later, the owner of the orchard came to the orchard, and he said to the guards, the fine first fruits of the fig tree that were in the orchard, where are they? The lame person said, I can't walk. How would I know? How would I be able to get to the figs? Can't blame me. The blind person says, do I have eyes with which to see the figs? So what did the owner of the orchard do? He placed the lame person upon the shoulders of the blind person, just as they did when they stole the figs, and he judged them as one. So too, and here's the rabbinic notion of consequences and resurrection of the dead. So to the Holy One, blessed be He, brings the soul on the day of judgment. So this is this post-messianic world where traditional Jewish belief is there's actually resurrection of the dead. Not in the Walking Dead idea, but actually returning whole. God brings the soul of the on the day of judgment, puts it back into the body as they were when they were alive in this world, and they sinned, and then God judges them as one. And so that's the idea. That's the basic concept of rabbinic Judaism, is that there is resurrection there is physical resurrection, but notice why, according to this teaching, there has to be physical resurrection. We're not talking now about any scientific proof. I mean, the rabbis obviously know that the bodies decompose in the ground, but in a theological sense, you can't be judged fairly unless you have all of your integrated wholeness returning. So the idea is more in theory, I would say. And we're going to see in a moment why, obviously, later generations had a little difficulty, or they tried to explain this. But in theory, so it makes sense in theory that you really need to believe, in a sense, or logically, one needs to believe in resurrection of the body and the return of the soul to that body for true judgment to be observed. Another view. Now, sometimes what the rabbis would do is, because resurrection, this notion of return from the dead and this reintegration of the soul and body was so essential to their belief system. And when I say the rabbis, we haven't really so much talked about, maybe I mentioned it once or twice, that at this period of time, the rabbinic period of time, maybe 200, maybe 100 before the Common Era to about the 6th century, there were other Jewish groups, at least up until the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. There were other Jewish groups that disagreed with this notion of resurrection, but that's one of the things that distinguished the group known as the rabbis, capital R, or the Pharisees, or sometimes we refer to them as the sages, the Prushim. This group, that's one of their distinguishing theological beliefs, was this resurrection of the dead. And that's why, what we were just talking about. Now, what they would sometimes then do is read back into the Torah or the Bible to prove that they understood the Bible correctly, and there really was this notion of resurrection in the Torah, even though, as we mentioned at the very beginning, it's not obvious. So here's an example of how they would read it in. So Rabbi Meir said, where is the resurrection of the dead derived in the Torah? It comes from this verse. This is the opening verse of the Song at the Sea. Then Moses and the children of Israel will sing this song to the Lord. Az Yashir. Yashir is in the future tense, imperfect tense in Hebrew. And it says, it's not stated they sang, Moses and the children of Israel sang the song to the Lord. It's not in the past tense, it's future tense. This is proof, therefore, that in the future, Moses is coming back from the dead, as well as all the Jews, Jewish people, and on behalf of God. So they'll sing to God in the future. Um, and here's another example in the book of Joshua. Um, there's a verse that says, Joshua will build an altar to the Lord God of Israel on Mount Ebal. That's from chapter 8 in the book of Joshua. So it doesn't say he built an altar. It says he will build. Obviously, from here, we can see this is proof for resurrection of the dead as derived in the Torah. Now, if you say, well, that's not exactly greatest proof in the world. I mean, it is literary, and well, you're right, but that's at least the proof that they were using to show that this notion of resurrection of the dead, which they believed in so strongly, as as an important element in true judgment, they needed to show that they didn't just make this up. They needed to show this wasn't just some, we got this notion from the Greeks or from some Eastern religions. The rabbis are very keen on showing that, all of these ideas that was part of their theological structure came from their source, this Torah itself. So here's, but again, this is from the Talmud. So the Talmud doesn't let things go. So it challenges. Wait a minute. You're saying that because it says Moses will sing, that's proof? What about this verse? In the First Kings, then Solomon will build an altar to Chemosh, an abomination, a false god of Moab. Okay, so wait a minute. It's good for the goose, good for the gander. So you're telling me that this is proof too, that in the future Solomon will build altars to false gods? That's what we're looking forward to? That he's also going to build this in the future? Oh, no. The response is, rather the use of the future tense here should be understood differently. Solomon did not build an altar to the idol. Rather, the use of the future tense teaches that the verse ascribes him blame as though he built it, since he did not prevent his wives from doing so. If you know the story of Solomon, he made a huge number, hundreds and hundreds of political marriages. The criticism that is made of Solomon is that he thought he was so smart because he's the most brilliant guy. He thought he would never, it wouldn't be a problem because the Torah tells us that the king is not allowed to have lots of wives. They can have more than one because that's permitted in the Torah, but they couldn't have many wives, and they weren't supposed to make alliances with idolatrous alliances. Solomon, who was so brilliant, well, I don't need to worry about that. In fact, we read at the end of his life, he was allowing his pagan wives to maintain their pagan practices in Jerusalem. So here's the Gemara says, wait a minute, if you're going to tell me that the proof that the Torah allows for a resurrection of the dead, or alludes to resurrection of the dead, based on this notion of using future tenses to describe what's going to happen that hasn't happened yet. Well, wait a minute. Here's the case of Solomon. Oh, you know what? That one doesn't count. That one is because it's not actually saying that he's going to build in the future world an altar to the idol. So they go back and forth. Well, here's another attempt by Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. From where is the resurrection of the dead derived from the Torah? It's derived from this verse in Psalms. Happy are they who dwell in your house. They will yet praise you. They'll praise you in the future. It's not stated they praised you, but they'll praise you in the future. From here, resurrection of the dead is derived from at least the Bible. Um, and then he said, then Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, anyone who recites song to God in this world is privileged, and then will recite it again in the world to come. Okay, so those are some examples of how the rabbis tried to prove that, in fact, our earliest sources always had this idea of resurrection, of physical resurrection of the dead, because it's so important for true judgment to occur. We also see it in the Siddur, um, in a passage um, in the come on, man, passage right in the first blessing on Shabbat morning, first blessing, praising God for creation. There's a little poem that we recite. Um, Incomparable our God in this world, inimitable our sovereign in the world to come, peerless our Redeemer in the days of the Messiah, singular our Savior at the resurrection of the dead. Well, here you have, in just 4 lines, basically what's the word I'm looking for? Template, template for um, Jewish notion of time. This world, then there's the world to come, which happens after death. There's somewhere people go. Then comes the Messiah into this world, and the Messiah inaugurates a period of true judgment, where true judgment can only occur when there is resurrection of the body and soul. People are put back together and integrated, reintegrated, so that they can be judged fairly. Now, also we have, I didn't put this in here, but we also have an example. The best example is another passage in the prayer book, the second blessing in the Amidah, the prayer that we recite 3 times a day. There are 19 individual during weekdays. During weekdays, there are 19 individual blessings that are recited in this prayer. It's the highlight of the worship service. On Shabbat, we remove the middle petitions in this prayer, and we replace it with just one paragraph, or several paragraphs actually, about Shabbat. But the second blessing, the first, second, and third blessings are always the same. They're every day of the week. We recite 3 initial blessings in this longer prayer, and the second blessing is about God's power. God is so powerful and distinguished from human beings that okay, is so powerful and distinguished from human beings that God can bring life to the dead. And that is Michayei HaMeitim. God gives life to the dead. Now we see that, I don't know, all the time. I mean, we're going to see it in a couple as the weeks go by, where you look at the trees, they're dead, nothing's growing, and then in a few weeks, oh my goodness, with the rain coming and the seasons changing, everything will bloom and be full of life again. So that we see that in every year, but and that's the model. That's the model for us, that actually in the of our own lives, that what we think is the end of life with death is actually simply the end of one stage and the beginning of the next one. Okay, so we see this in the rabbinic teachings. Now, moving on to the medieval period, the rationalists had, well, there were some medieval philosophers who pushed against this notion. Maimonides is one of the most famous because he was not only the greatest of the thinkers, he was very much taken with Greek thought. Aristotle, he was an Aristotelian, or at least Aristotle influenced his thinking very much. And he sought to bring together and this is really this goes all the way back to our first lessons. For those of you who were at the beginning with theology, happens when one way of thinking meets another way of thinking, and now you have to put ideas together. Same thing with philosophy. Um, you start to you have questions, and you that result from um, interacting with different cultures or different ideologies. And so, um, in Maimonides' case, the notion of the afterlife was affected. He felt that Jews think about the afterlife in too materialistic a way. And he writes that in his section on repentance, the ultimate and perfect reward, the final bliss, which will suffer neither interruption nor diminution, is the life in the world to come. Okay, so our life in this world is limited, it's finite, we're restricted in so many, we're limited in so many ways, and if nothing, especially in terms of time, we only have a certain amount of time in this world. It's the world, and the next world is going to be a much greater bliss. No interruption, no diminution. Okay. The good reserved for the righteous is life in the world to come, a life which is immortal, a good without evil. In the world to come, there is nothing corporeal and no material substance. There are only souls of the righteous. Now, this idea, which I think many rationalist people would say, well, if I got to believe that there's life after this world, that makes a lot of sense because again, we know that the body is material, it decomposes. It doesn't last forever. But what is unique to us that we would say is immortal, is unique to each individual, is our inner life, what we call it, our soul, our spirit, whatever you want to call it, that, or our consciousness, that is unique. And that, as we'll get to a little later, that's what I think most of us push against when we think about, is there a world, or I shouldn't say think about, when we hope that there's a world to come, that there's a world after our physical death. I think most of us are thinking about that uniqueness of who we are, with our consciousness, our soul. That's what really makes us who we are. And so we hope that lives on forever. Um, this though got Maimonides in a whole load of trouble because that is not the traditional rabbinic view. And Maimonides is the great leader of his generation and thinker and supposed to be the defender of the faith. So what are you talking about? So um, he has to say, and which perhaps he really believed, or what many thinkers believe that he kind of was forced to say, was the resurrection of the dead is one of the cardinal principles established by Moses. A person who does not believe in this principle does not cleave to the Jewish religion. Resurrection is only for the righteous. So that is part of his list of the ikarim, the essential principles that, according to Maimonides, a Jew must believe. He has a whole list, um, and there are 13. There's 13 of them, 13 midot, that you as a Jew have to believe. And one of them is this notion of resurrection of the dead. But in another book, he said there's there's no material substance in the world to come. So how does he square the circle? So Maimonides' solution was to say this. Okay, this is what I meant, is that there is death in this world and there is resurrection, but it's a very long, involved process. So human beings in this world die, but at some point the Messiah comes, and the Messiah will bring about a change in world history. history as we know it will end, and there will be a new period to the world that will begin. And in this new period, following the Messiah, this is going to last for 1,000 years. And during this 1,000 years, there will be physical resurrection. So here's that traditional Jewish view that he's interposing here. You're going to have those who died before will be resurrected because they must be judged. The only way to be judged is to have your physical and spiritual components put together again. So there'll be judgment. This is going to take place for a limited amount of time. He calls it 1,000 years. But after that 1,000 years, because after the judgment, what is that even? I mean, you're being judged. What's the point of being judged? If you didn't make it, you weren't good enough, you had too many demerits, well, it's been nice knowing you. But if you merit, a righteous eternal life, at that point, it's the soul that lives forever. That's the Olam Haba. And so you can see he's got both here. He's got the resurrection, which is traditional view, and then you've got the soul's immortality. And unfortunately, as great a thinker as Maimonides, we all loved, people love to study him, and we honor his teachings. He wasn't a big fan of open enrollment in Olam Haba. He had a very limited, very exclusive club. So really only a very limited number of righteous souls, according to Maimonides, were actually going to end up forever immortal, have their immortal soul. Most of us would get that, God willing, would get that resurrection period for a return to life for a limited amount of time. But we'd fall a little short of the eternal soul. But that was Maimonides. But you can see that what Maimonides was dealing with is the reality that the body doesn't live forever. What does live forever, or at least a longer time, potentially a much immortal period of time, is the soul. And that means that what we do with our souls is essential, and we have to prepare that. So yes, it's true, the body, he doesn't go as far as to say, like the body's a prison, but rather we really want to do good in this world because our soul is craving it. And that's the emphasis for Maimonides and many of the rationalists, is that our goal of doing mitzvot, studying Torah, all of this was to enrich our spiritual self. Okay, well then we get to let's move on to the another. I mean, we're doing a real quick survey here, but there's another medieval view that develops a little bit after the time of Maimonides, and this is Kabbalah and the mystical view. Now, Kabbalah goes as far back as the rabbinic period. We know that there were Kabbalistic, what we would call mystical texts and esoteric texts during the rabbinic period. And many rationalists in the medieval period were also in some way mystical in their own way. But the Kabbalistic movement, and it really develops in the 12th century, 13th century in Spain, and they begin to develop very complex psychological concepts of the human person. And this relates to the afterlife. So just one Kabbalistic teaching, an early one, this is around like the 1200s, is the development of a tripartite soul. There are three components to the soul, and they have a name. Each one has a name. And the three names are names that we often use to describe a spiritual sense. One term is nefesh, ruach, which is usually in modern Hebrew is like spirituality, um, and nishama. Nishama is also so nefesh and nishama are sometimes used in the biblical period to mean the soul. Um, Technically, the nefesh is actually in biblical Hebrew it's your throat, and nishama is breathing. But you can see what that both of these have to do with an area of the body where the throat, and the breathing have to do with a non-material, an incorporeal component, um, and ruach also means wind. So but the way the Kabbalists understood each of these components was this, that the nefesh was like the lowest level of the soul. It was about the vital energy. It's what animates our physical body. So it's that very lowest level of what allows our body to move and do things and desires. Um, Ruach rises above the basic vitalistic nature of the soul. Um, Might be, it's the part of us that cares about people and are affected by our emotions. And then finally, the neshama is the supernal level, the divine level, which is awakened and made stronger by our observance of the mitzvot and our study of Torah. So the neshama now, and that goes back to the creation of Adam. When Adam is created, God breathes linshom, the divine breath into Adam, which animates the human person, makes Adam different from all the other animals. So it's that nishama is like the divine breath that is in each of us. Okay, so that was one early part. Over time, it develops into actually five parts, where we have the nefesh, which is understood as the appetite or appetitive awareness. That's part, oh, I'm hungry, I better go get something to eat. There's ruach, which is emotional awareness. Nishama, which now moves into the intellect. The nishama is our cognitive abilities. Number four, the fourth level now is called chaya, which is the divine force which allows us to gain pleasure beyond physical motivation. So it's that component where and this is at a very high level. So it is the person who finds bliss in Torah study, in mitzvot. Yeah, it's not in any kind of, it's not our physical appetites that bring us pleasure, but these higher actions. And then there's finally the fifth level is called yichida, which is the unification of all the soul's faculties with God. It's the highest level that you can reach as a human person, having that unification basically of your total psyche with God. All right. But we're talking about after the afterlife. Each part goes through different experiences in their afterlife journey. So the lower level of the soul, the appetite part of our soul, is purified and purged of physical and emotional attachments. Um, so, well, it's, in this place, probably it's also even the ruach. So this is the idea that you sometimes hear and leads to the recitation of Kaddish, mourner's Kaddish, for the 12 months that the child recites for the mourner's Kaddish for 12 months after their parent dies. It's this that the soul goes on a journey, this lower part of the soul goes on a journey for 12 months in which it must be purged of all wrongdoing, sins, taint. and can it can be described sometimes as extremely painful. The only good thing about it is, and the way it's different from the Christian idea of going to hell, is that it's not forever. It's a very limited amount because there's a goal involved here. It's you're going through the wash. You're going through the you're being like silver, silver which gets which one that you want to clean. The silversmith wants to clean the silver of all impurities, so he puts it into the fire, it melts, and then you get rid of all the junk that was in the silver, and you get this pure silver. Um, so it's goal oriented, I guess I'd call it. Um, but it is something that needs to be purged of physical and emotional attachments. But the higher levels of the soul we talked about, the nishama, the chaya, the yichida, they experience transcendental bliss from the moment of death. And sometimes at a funeral, the way I talk about it is, just to put it in the simplest terms, is that at the moment of death, there's a separation between our physical and spiritual components, and the spiritual returns to God, the source, the divine source, that nishama, that, but the physical remains have to return to its source, which is the earth, and that's why we take it upon ourselves at a funeral to cover the um, the casket with a blanket of earth. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. The idea being that it's our responsibility to assist that part of our person to its source, to return to its source. So death, yeah. Oh, I apologize. You had a question. Um, death is a separation between body and soul. Now, some Kabbalistic views refer to something known as a guf hadak. Guf is a word for body, and I think hadak here is something that attaches. But what it was a spiritual post-mortem body. It was like this translucent um, image that was attached to the body even after death. Um, and I think that that's a really interesting notion because, as we'll get to some of the modern thinkers about this, is it's really, really hard to think of ourselves in any way other than bodily terms, even when we want to think about the soul as existing beyond the body. How do you think of a soul that doesn't have any corporeal material element? Um, and it's very hard to to imagine that. Some Kabbalistic thinkers spoke about a some kind of like a translucent element that surrounded the soul so that it was definable, I guess. Now, there are a couple other notions of Kabbalistic thinking about afterlife. They talk about Gehenna, and you'll sometimes hear Jews talk about Gehenna. Um, the origin of it is from the biblical Gehinom, which is the valley, which is an actual valley. Gay is a valley, and so it's an actual valley outside of Jerusalem, where I think originally that's where they would bring the dead bodies because you weren't supposed to bury bodies in Jerusalem itself. So the Gay Hinnom, this valley, this place was where they brought the dead bodies. It eventually becomes a synonymous with like hell. So you've got Gan Eden is the term we would use for paradise, heaven. Gan Eden, of course, the Garden of Eden in the Bible. And Gehenna becomes synonymous with a place I'd say you don't want to go, but that's kind of like where everybody goes, unless they're really, a very unique individual, a very holy, saintly person. But most people go through Gehenna, which is this purgation place, purging. Um, and so Gehenna now is considered as a place of purification in which psychic remnants from the previous life are purged and transformed. But that's really so even the negative place where people go after death has a positive spin to it because the soul is going there to be transformed. It's not eternal. It's not eternal damnation. It is transformative because you got to, the things you didn't take care of in this world, they need to be purged. Um, and the Zohar, which is the classic Kabbalistic text written in the 13th century, tradition tells us it's written in the 2nd century by one of the great mystical rabbis, but it was actually put together in the 13th century in Spain. It's written there, and they follow the teaching in the Talmud that this period of transformation, soul transformation, lasts 12 months. Um, the idea of Gan Eden, heaven, paradise, whatever, is conceived of in a dual sense that there are like two levels, we'll call it, of Gan Eden. There's lower Gan Eden, which is a realm in which one experiences the bliss of higher emotions. And then there's the upper Gan Eden, which is a more transcendent realm, in which one realizes the results of one's lofty spiritual thoughts from the previous life, and you end up communing directly with God. So, and some and souls, as we mentioned a minute ago, they go on these components of the soul all have their different journeys after death, according to the Kabbalists. And some souls then reach that lower Gan Eden level, and that's about as high as they go, where again it's blissful. It's the experience of these blissful, all these positive, caring, transcendent emotions that one has can imagine. And then upper Gan Eden, which is for the very lofty, the highest, the most pious ones, where they connect directly with God. Um, and then, oh, and then there's one more level that sometimes the Kabbalists speak of, which is that these souls don't even remain in Gan Eden forever, but they enter what's known as Tzror HaChaim. Chaim is life. Tzror is the bundle of life or the bundle of living. And that is a region of celestial realms where a disembodied soul returns in order to prepare for eventual rebirth. And this is something also that the Kabbalists brought in, this notion of reincarnation. So all of these ideas, and I'm telling you, like people, oh no, Jews don't believe in reincarnation. Oh no, Jews don't believe in heaven. Well, actually, we believe in, well, obviously, I just pointed out, life after this, afterlife is essential, according to Maimonides, who was a little, even Maimonides, who was a little complicated in his views, states that every Jew has to, you got to believe that there's a life after this one. And here we're seeing that even the notion of reincarnation, or Gilgul is the term, Gilgul HaNefesh in Hebrew, um, developed during this period and became increasingly important during this Kabbalistic period. Um, why? What's the point of reincarnation for the Kabbalists? Well, it was a process of physical re-embodiment made possible for one to fulfill all the mitzvot. So they went like one step further. So if you believe that that after death there is this period where the soul goes to its source, or maybe even components of the soul go to various sources in the next of the spirit in the spiritual realm, and the physical returns to the earth only to be returned at the end of time so that the human person can be judged fairly. um, because you've got to have the body and the spirit together. It can't be one or the other. It's not fair. So you got to have the two parts together to be judged fairly. Here, and to be judged whether you've done the mitzvot that you could have done, the things that the mitzvot that you broke, the sins that you created. So you have to be brought together to in order to be judged. Here, the notion of Gilgul HaNefesh, of reincarnation, is so that you get like you need another chance to finish up what you missed out on in this life. You didn't do all these mitzvot. Now you're brought back after this long process to return to the world to fulfill mitzvot you missed. Now there were different views regarding this. Some said only wicked people went through Gilgul HaNefesh because obviously they missed out. You know, they didn't check off all the boxes of all the mitzvot they were supposed to do. So they got to come back and make sure they get a sticker or a check mark for all the ones they missed. Others suggested, no, the righteous are the ones who return because they need to assist others in higher spiritual aspiration, and to encourage others to observe the mitzvot. So you have these different notions, but again, the point of it is to allow the person to complete what they didn't complete in this world, and what they didn't complete was again a life of mitzvot. Now, Kabbalists did reaffirm the rabbinic belief in resurrection of the dead. They added a spiritual context to the doctrine, understanding that the resurrection as being a materialization of the fully awakened spiritual body. So they are talking about, even as my understanding is, that this resurrection is again a resurrection of this like guf hadak, this element, this physical definition of the body, but it's really not the person again. I mean, it's not like we look like today, but it is this fully awakened spiritual body. So these are different views that medievalists had about, and obviously the early rabbinic period had about um, the importance of an afterlife, and not only the importance of an afterlife, but even the notion of a physical resurrection, a physical re-embodiment, so that the person can be judged appropriately. Um, Now, once we get into the modern world, we return to so the Kabbalistic period brings us into that mystical concepts, and we talked about all these different components of the soul and what happens after death. Well, beginning with the modern period, and Moses Mendelssohn is usually one of the people we identify as the bringing Judaism back to or into modernity. Moses Mendelssohn, one of the great medieval philosophers, he was the same period of time as Immanuel Kant, um, and again traveled in the same circles, intellectual circles. So Mendelssohn's a return to rationalism, and he argues that there is the immortality of the soul. He de-emphasizes physical resurrection, but emphasizes the immortality of the soul. And basically his argument is, well, the soul is a simple substance. It's a unified substance. Obviously it's not a substance. You can't find the soul. Person dies, you can't find it, or you open up a living person, you can't find the soul. But his idea was that the simple substances are indestructible, like you can't reduce them. So he understood that the soul was this kind of simple, unified element. It's a unity of the composites of the within the body, and so therefore it's irreducible. So that's one reason for the immortality of the soul. It doesn't decompose. You can't break it apart. It's a unity. Um, Secondly, he uses an argument that it's inconceivable that God would encourage humans to pursue perfection on earth and then deprive them of the opportunity to achieve it with death. And this is, again, a very logical or a rational argument. Why would God give us, why would human beings develop to a point where we have a consciousness, where we're aware of good and evil, if before we complete our journey to being completely good people, we die. We don't get a chance to continue this journey anymore. So it's important to believe that there is life after this one, because we have basically a duty, a responsibility to continue perfecting ourselves. And if there was nothing after this world, um, then we wouldn't be able to participate. We'd be locked out of that opportunity. In a sense, it's going back to this this answer to the question of why do good people suffer? And the answer is because this isn't the only world. If we suffer in this world, and this was a classic rabbinic response, if you suffer in this world, that's actually not such a bad thing, because it means you are paying off whatever debts you owe in the next world. It's people who have it easy in this world who are the ones who have to worry, because in the next world they're going to owe a lot. They're going to, nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. So if we suffer in this world, you're paying off those debts in this earthly life. So here he's saying kind of a corollary of that, which is we human beings want to do better always. And the idea of life after death allows us to know that we can continue to pursue that perfection after this earthly life ends. Um, he says divine providence, the notion that God is looking out for people, and that again, the good are rewarded and the evil are punished. That can only be reconciled with immortality, because of course we know so much suffering in this world, so many undeserved early deaths, so much suffering from illness. It can't, the world is a cruel place if you don't have this notion that the soul is immortal, and that it will, whatever, if you've suffered in this world unjustly, you'll be rewarded in the next world. So that's his argument. And finally, without the idea of an afterlife, why would anybody sacrifice their life for another? Right? That doesn't, you sacrifice yourself because you know that there's a higher, transcendent life after this one. So I'm willing to put my own life on the line, um, because otherwise nobody would ever be willing to make that sacrifice for another. So it's a only way to legitimate such an offering is if there's a reward in life for the one making the sacrifice. Um, Here's another more modern, not exactly contemporary. He died. He lived in the 1900s. He lived in the 20th century. Robert Gordis, very prominent conservative rabbi and philosopher or theologian. Um, and this was his understanding. He says that the conviction that physical death does not end everything for the human person, that in some sense the human person's life is indestructible, and that spirit is endowed with immortality. What is immortality? So he pulls back a little bit. He says, better not to try to peer beneath the veil, right? Let's not try to get too specific, because we can't ever really know. But he cautiously recommends the notion of spiritual immortality, the facet in the human person's nature which is deathless, the vital spark, that breath of life is what we call the soul. So it's not the physical part of the human person which is forever. It's that spiritual immortality lies in the soul. Um, and he too is arguing that we just don't believe that the physical death is the end of the human person, that there's something that goes beyond that. There's something that transcends the human person. Louis Jacob, who was one of the great Jewish theologians, he's a British rabbi, began as an Orthodox rabbi, but broke with Orthodoxy over some traditional notions. He also argues that it's spiritual immortality. He writes, unless we are prepared to accept the biological details of an actual recomposition of the physical body, we are still affirming a version of the mortality of the soul, even when we affirm the doctrine of resurrection. Meaning, okay, unless you want to really believe in something which is hard to believe, which is that you go and you find a body that's been buried for 100 years, 200 years, and it's decomposed. There's no skin on it. It's just the bones. And okay, unless you want to really believe that somehow that's going to come back into existence, you're still okay with the notion of uh, uh, um, wait, what does he say? No, I think I'm reading this wrong here. We are still affirming a version of the mortality of the soul. So unless, if you believe that the body isn't going to ever be recomposed, then in a sense, you're kind of saying the person's over. Even when we reaffirm the doctrine of resurrection, you still have to admit that this is problematic. This is really hard to imagine of an afterlife. Nevertheless, we ought to be frank enough to admit that all the speculations regarding life here on earth after the resurrection simply don't ring a bell for us, whereas the more spiritual interpretation of Maimonides does. So he's saying that on the one hand, it's even hard to believe in the immortality of the soul, because where does it go? What does it mean to be resurrected? I mean, if you can't believe in the physical resurrection of the recomposition of the body, you know, is it any easier to believe that the soul lasts forever? On the other hand, he's saying, but when we speculate about life on earth, um, this notion of spiritual immortality is a little easier to accept. In the end though, he does caution. He says, still he falls back on religious agnosticism regarding the afterlife, meaning he's not really sure. And he says it is narrow to project our poor earthly imaginings onto the landscape of heaven. So it's just very hard to um, it's hard to imagine it, but on the other hand, um, we don't know. We just don't know what the next world is going to be like, or what happens after death. That's a better way to put it. We just don't know what's going to happen after death. But you can see in Louis Jacobs, who, I mean, again, a great thinker, is is admitting that the doubt that is normative about what happens after death. Um, it's very hard for us to believe in physical resurrection. It's not, it's kind of hard to believe that the soul also, and yet we don't know. We just don't know what happens in the next after death. And we do have a tradition, a very strong tradition that says there is something. The arguments we've heard so far are cogent in terms of the logic of living in this world. But he admits it's tough. Now, what's interesting is during the same period that Louis Jacobs is living, we see a return to the importance of physical resurrection among certain modern thinkers. And one of them was Will Herberg, very interesting 20th century thinker. Started off as a Marxist and was turned off by Marxism, and then he was a Jewish person, not really knowledgeable about his Judaism, but eventually came back to it and became a very important um, thinker who was able to bridge certain traditional views with modern thinking. So listen how he puts this about resurrection. The symbol, note well, of resurrection of the dead expresses the depth and dimensions of Hebraic religion in relation to the destiny of mankind more adequately, perhaps, than any other concept. Notice he calls this the symbol. So, by calling it the symbol, he's not necessarily saying, he's not kind of making a claim whether it's true, it's accurate or not. He's just saying that from our perspective, again, we don't know what happens after death. From our perspective, the symbolic importance of the notion of resurrection of the dead is crucial because of its relationship to the destiny of humanity. And then he goes on to explain. Herberg wants us to focus our attention on the indispensability of believing in resurrection because he writes, the actual world is written off as worthless to the idealist. It doesn't matter what history may bring. I will pursue truth, cherish beauty, fulfill my obligations. You can hear here his critique of Marxism. In other words, it does not matter what happens to human beings, to individuals. Who cares? Because I care about the ideas are everything. The one true reality is the timeless ideal, and the true meaning of life is a single-minded devotion to it. Matter is devaluated as evil, intrinsically unreal and impotent, while mind is exalted as spiritual and eternal, the very heart of all that is real and good. That's what he's pushing against. He's coming from a world where these kind of idealistic notions are everything. The individual doesn't really matter. What happens in this world doesn't really matter. It's the great ideas that matter. And he's pushing back and he's saying, no, it is the human person, flesh and blood that matters. And so therefore, the idea, symbol of resurrection of the dead is crucial. The whole point of the doctrine of resurrection is that the life we live now, the life of the body, the life of empirical existence in society, empirical meaning facts and of what we do, and that it actually exists, that we can quantify in society and measure in some way, has some permanent worth in the eyes of God and will not vanish in the transmutation of things at the last day. So that's what he's put. So you can see here, he's not necessarily, I mean, in a sense, he's arguing, hey, we can't know what happens, but you know what? If I got to believe something, I'm going to believe in resurrection of the dead because the idea is so meaningful and it says something about the importance of my real life right now. And then there's another great thinker, Daniel Matt, whose son, no, wait. No, this is Herschel Matt. Daniel Matt, his son, he's the one who translated the Zohar into English and did an amazing job of translating it and explaining the real meaning of for us lay people, the meaning of the Zohar. But his father, Herschel Matt, was a great rabbi as well and great thinker. And he talks about it a little bit differently than Herberg. He doesn't talk about it as symbol, he talks about it as myth. Myth in this sense. We are speaking not in terms of literal truth, but mythical or poetic truth. A mythical or poetic statement seeks to point to a truth and to affirm a truth, which is beyond the power of science to demonstrate, beyond the power of experience fully to confirm, beyond the power of logic to prove, beyond the power of rational discourse to convey. This is what I was talking about last week with Purim when I said Purim is a fictional book, but it's the truest book in the Bible, meaning that it's mythic, in that myth is not like, it's something that doesn't exist, but myth is a way of trying to explain true beliefs or true views that may not be literally true, but say something about the meaningfulness in life. And so he's saying that same thing here about resurrection of the dead, that mythically you can't demonstrate it. You don't have science can't prove it. It's beyond the power of experience, but you know what? Its meaning, its truthfulness is powerful. The truth here being affirmed by the concept of Tichiyat Metim, resurrection of the dead, or giving life to the dead, includes these affirmations. So here's the things that he learns from the idea of resurrection of dead, or the myth. God's purpose for humanity is not ultimately fulfilled in this life. Can't do it. We don't have enough time, so it's not ultimately fulfilled in this world. That it is not ultimately defeated, however, by death. Death doesn't end our meaningful existence. That the ultimate fulfillment is beyond death and beyond history, and that this fulfillment involves full awareness by a real person that being in God's presence and under God's judgment, he or she must accept the full responsibilities and full consequences for one's life. So the notion of resurrection of the dead also teaches me that everything I do matters. It's not going to be forgotten after I'm gone, after I'm physically gone from this world. There is a comeuppance, and so I better take this life very seriously. The value now, so those are the last thing I want to say about that. So some 20th century thinkers have come back to the notion of resurrection of the dead, being aware that literally it's very hard to accept because we know how the world works. We know, scientifically it's very hard to understand. But let's not get hung up exclusively with scientific facts in this case, that there's something bigger than the notion of life after death than just this literal attempt to make sense of it in empirical data. Um, Now, the last thing I just wanted to say, well, we're running out of time here, but I did want to, well, I'll just say it as opposed to read it. Neil Gilman, who was a teacher of mine at the seminary, also a wonderful theologian for the modern theologian, um, writes about, and I think in my book list I suggested this book. I can't remember. Maybe I didn't suggest. But anyway, it's called The Death of Death by Neil Gilman. It's a wonderful book on this topic. And he ends by sharing his personal views, his personal theology. And the basic thrust of it is the value of an embodied existence is really crucial. It's very hard, as I mentioned earlier, for us to think of ourselves without thinking of our body. It's hard to imagine a pure soul. And our hopes for tikkun, and when he means tikkun here, for repairing ourselves, repairing the world, making the world a better place in this world, our hopes for that are meaningless unless we take the human body seriously. To believe in future perfection of world bodies is essential. So we really need to understand our human selves as that integrated whole. You can't think of ourselves just as a soul or a spiritual element. We're also our bodies. And so the relationship between the mind and the body, the relationship between the soul and the body is essential. And I can't really separate the two. So in thinking about this world, I have to see myself as a whole. I shouldn't, it's very dangerous to divide yourself and think of yourself as, well, I'm just my body. That's all that matters. Or the opposite. I'm just a soul. I'm a soul who is forced to live in this finite contraption I call my body. And so I'm stuck in it because I really would like to free myself of this. That's very, very dangerous, because you really can't think of yourself as as separate. And therefore, when we look into the future, when when we're not alive in this world anymore, it's very hard for us to consider anything beyond this world without thinking of our body and our soul, or what makes us unique, um, integrated. So doesn't mean you have to believe that there's anything in this after this world. There are, when I grew up in the Reform movement. I think I've mentioned, and the message that many of my teachers in the Reform movement would give is our immortality lies in our, in the good that we do in this world lives on after us. Um, that's a lovely way to think about things too, or in our children. Well, what if you don't have any children? And as uh, much as we, most of us are not going to get holidays named after us. We're not going to be not George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. So most of us are not going to have that. And even in our own families, I wish I knew something about my great grandparents. I know the names of some of them. That's about as much as I know. So to tell me that we live on in the good we do in this world and our reputations, is a lovely sentiment. But that's kind of hard too, because most people are not remembered after 50, 100 years after they're gone. Um, so then, and that leads into questions of, well, what's the meaning of my life? What's the point? Whereas this notion of resurrection, and that there is life after this world, however one conceives of it, and it is very hard to conceive of it without thinking of some physical, corporeal representation, um, is very, very important to impacting on how we live in this world. So I don't know if people have questions. I know I've gone over my 9 o'clock end time, but if you have any questions, you can always send them to me. Um, but I think this is the importance of the idea, of this notion of afterlife, and why it just drives me nuts when I hear Jewish people say, "Oh no, we don't believe in the afterlife." Yes, we do. It's very important that we do. Um, okay, so this is okay. Oh, so this week we finished the life cycle section, and I'll send out a new syllabus. We're going to talk about Pesach, the holiday of Passover and Shavuot next. And then we just have one more section on historical periods of Judaism, periods of Jewish history. And that'll take us into the very beginning of June. Um, what I was going to say that, for those of you who started in the middle, didn't beginning, where you started. We'll pick it up. I'm definitely gonna do this class again starting in the fall. And but you can also, if you want, I record all these classes, so you can ask to um, watch the recordings as well. Okay, everybody have a good evening. And we will, and Paul, I owe you a response about Passover and the Seder, so I'll get to you. I just have to get through I just have to get through Purim. All right, everybody have a good evening.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good night.
Thanks, Rabbi. Have
Good
a
night.
good
Have a
night.
good evening.